Everyone in Alum Creek who's been around long enough has their own take on what happened. Hell, even a good number of the younger folks think they've got it all figured out, but don't put too much stock in the stories of anyone who wasn't actually there. It's like that old game we played as kids. You know, the one with a piece of string and two cups where you whisper a message around a circle. We called it telephone. The difference is, in telephone, the message starts off simple and turns into nonsense. But with this story, it's the opposite. The more times it's told, the more reasonable it sounds. It's like people unconsciously tweak the details to make it feel more believable, like they don't want to come off as crazy. Just the other day, my own grandson had the nerve to tell me I had it all wrong, that it was nothing more than a tragic accident and something about an albino bear. A 12-year-old telling his own grandpa what he should and shouldn't remember. Something about that just don't sit right with me. But truth be told, even most of us old-timers weren't actually there. The way folks talk, you'd think half the town's miners were caught up in it, the same way every boomer you meet will swear they were at Woodstock. In reality, maybe 20 of us saw it firsthand, and most of them are long gone, buried, except for old Rushy Sang, that stubborn bastard had himself cremated. Anyway, let me start again. Forgive me if I repeat myself, it was 1956. Like just about every young man around, I worked in the mines, hard work, but honest, and it paid better than anything else I was qualified for. I had a wife, a kid, and another on the way, so I did what I had to do. My crew was tight. Ralph Hatfield, Rogic Sang, and Sid McNamara. After work, we'd usually hit the bar, though I left early most nights for my family. Rashi never drank, just ordered juice. Now, Ralph couldn't stand the bartender. Most of us couldn't. Jess felt only had the job because he wasn't cut out for real labor. He even hired kids to mow his lawn and do his yard work, and acted like that made him smarter than the rest of us. I don't think I ever saw Jess in town without that damn smug grin on his face. Ralph was convinced Jess got the job by sleeping with the widowed bar owner. I wasn't so sure, but it wasn't out of the question. Jess had his way with women, smooth talker with a sharp nose and high cheekbones. He'd been with at least 2 girls in town and had a trail of exes behind him. That alone was enough to make most men dislike him. But Ralph had an even better reason. If you're not from West Virginia, you've probably heard all about the Hatfields and McCoys, but that feud's ancient history compared to the bad blood between the Hatfields and the Felts. During the Coal Wars, the Hatfields fought for the Unions while the Felts owned the mines, but Jess never let it bother him. If someone brought it up, he'd just crack a joke. He had a way with words and never lost his temper, which made it hard for most folks to truly hate him. Everyone except Ralph. Then came June 10th, right in the thick of cicada season. They were everywhere that year. So bad you could skid on their guts if your tires were bald. The mine gave us a break from the constant screeching, at least while we worked. But this time it was worse inside than out. The sound echoed, a harsh, unnatural noise that didn't even have the rhythm of a cricket's song. It was unsettling, so we dug deeper, far enough that we couldn't hear a thing. A few hours in, I noticed an opening to a new chamber. It was narrow, too tight for most men to squeeze through, but Rashi was built like a stick, damn near thin enough to slip between the bars of a crib. Anytime we found a crack in the rock, he was the one we sent through first. None of us were eager to squeeze through that narrow gap, but Rashi wasn't one to hesitate. We waited no more than 10 minutes before he wriggled back out, his face alight with excitement like I'd never seen before. "Stop all other mining," he said in his thick accent. "It's a treasure room." Now, in most mines, a demolition expert carefully measures out the black powder, and the unlucky soul who draws the short straw has to light the fuse. But most mines didn't have Sid McNamara, the craziest son of a bitch I ever knew. Sid handled all the blasting himself, always getting as close to the explosion as sanity would allow. We all figured he'd meet the same end as his Irish grandfather, blown to pieces in some godforsaken hole. But somehow he always walked away. This time was no different. He blasted that narrow passage wide open without so much as a scratch, and we all crowded in to see Rashiso, called Treasure Room. What we found wasn't gold, not technically, it was coal, but there was so much of it, and it was so easy to extract that it might as well have been. The mine owner was over the moon. He put out the call for every able-bodied man in town, offering double wages. Even Jess Felt, who normally wouldn't lift a finger for honest work, signed up for a few weeks of labor at that price. We worked ourselves to the bone, pulling as many hours as we could manage. Jess predictably was the laziest of us all, but no one called him out on it. After all, we still needed him to pour our drinks at the bar once the shift was over. Now, I can't say for certain who spotted it first. Maybe it was Felt, and if it was, well, that's what you call cruel irony. He came strutting back with that smug grin of his, telling us he'd found something else. Another passage. This one wasn't like the last. It was wide enough for a man to walk through upright. Inside was another room, small but filled knee-deep with loose coal. That should have been a red flag. Coal doesn't just sit on the surface like that, piled up and ready to be scooped into bags. But greed got the better of us, and soon we had 2 rooms to work. A handful of newer guys were assigned to the smaller chamber. We called it the Parrot's Chest. I won't lie. We pushed our luck. We robbed pillars, cut too aggressively, and ignored the warning signs. But that room should not have collapsed. I've been through cave-ins before. Natural ones, and this wasn't like any of them. Some of the others say everything was fine right up until the moment it happened. That's not true. There was a sound I can still hear when I close my eyes. The logical explanation is that the men in the Pirate's Chest shouted when the walls gave out. But that's not what I heard. It was a scream, all right, but not a human one. It wasn't a cry of pain or fear. If you asked me what I imagine a demon's yawn would sound like, I wouldn't have to guess. I already know. We woke something up. Something that had been buried beneath all that coal. The 3 men working the Pirate's Chest were swallowed whole, sucked under like the coal had turned to quicksand, like something massive beneath them had inhaled and pulled them down. Then the real collapse began. The larger chamber, the one where me and my crew were working, was the first to go. The passageway Sid had blasted out crumbled in on itself without so much as a groan of warning. Most of us managed to escape in time, sprinting through the corridor as the mine caved in behind us. A few weren't so lucky. They were buried where they stood, crushed like insects under a boot. Hooper Collins wasn't killed outright, but he might as well have been. A boulder pinned his leg, and that was the end of him. 19, maybe 20 years old. Married to a pretty girl with no kids yet. Death sure has a cruel way of choosing its victims. When the dust settled and I could finally stop coughing, I heard Hooper screaming in agony. I did everything I could to roll the rock off him, but before I could make any real progress, Ralph let out a sharp yell and pointed. A few of the newer miners had panicked and rushed into the Pirate's Chest, thinking it was a safe place to hide. Stupid bastards. The next screams I heard were definitely human. I didn't turn to look, didn't need to. There's no mistaking the sound of flesh being torn apart. I gave up on Collins and ran. I still hear his voice in my head, pleading with me not to leave him. I've tried to forget the exact words he used, but I've never managed. I didn't run far, just around the corner where the rest of the survivors were gathering. Every able body huddled together near the cave-in, desperately trying to dig through. It was useless, but I joined in anyway. What else was there to do? Then the screaming stopped, and the eating began. It went on for what felt like half an hour. Ripping, crunching, sucking. We all knew what was being devoured, and the horror of it only made us dig faster. But eventually, the sheer panic wore off, and the realization crept in. What was back there? And, more importantly, what would it do when it was finished? We weren't making any progress. Deep down, we knew that. But we were West Virginians, and if nothing else, we were stubborn. Still, as terrible as those wet, tearing sounds had been, the silence that followed was far worse. It was done eating, and now, maybe, it was looking for more. Damn it, everyone stop. We need to think this through. Sid McGammer's voice cut through the tension like a blade. The Irishman raised his lantern, and for the first time since the collapse, we saw each other clearly. A dozen of us stood there, haggard and terrified. Some crying, others so far gone they'd soiled themselves. But every last one of us was shaking, cold despite the heat trapped underground. For a moment, the frantic digging stopped. So did the whispering, all except for Rodney, the preacher's son, who had fallen to his knees, murmuring prayers that only grew louder. Rodney wasn't half as righteous as his father, but none of us were about to tell him to stop. Couldn't hurt to have at least one of us asking heaven for help. The first to speak after that was Ralph Hatfield. Always had a clear head, Ralph did. Even went to college for a couple of years. He kept his voice low, unlike Sid, so we had to lean in close to hear. It'll take days to dig ourselves out. That thing will get us first if dehydration doesn't. And it's guarding the TNT if we have to use it. Jess felt was the next to speak, though he wasn't doing a great job of hiding the shake in his voice. Wu can post guards. Keep watch. Make sure it doesn't come in here. You volunteering? Ralph asked, raising an eyebrow. Jess hesitated. I just meant. You'd rather stand around than dig like the rest of us, Ralph muttered. No, Ike. The problem is, Sid cut in, most of the water and lights are back there. With it. That shut Jess up. We've got it outnumbered, someone mumbled. It can die, right? Of course it can, Ralph said, his confidence steady as ever. I read an article in National Geographic once. Whole issue on undiscovered species. Most life in the ocean is unknown, and caves have their own creatures we've never catalogued. This thing is an animal. And animals can die. What's it eat, then? I asked. No one answered for a long moment. Then Ralph nodded toward the coal. Coal's got energy in it. It's made of carbon, just like living things. There are organisms that digest minerals. Lithophiles, they're called. I don't know if Ralph was right. Even now, I can't say if my memory is perfect or if I'm just telling myself it was. But I wanted to believe him. I really did, because the alternative was much, much worse. Rodney, who had been muttering all this time, suddenly raised his voice, his prayer turning into a shout. It's no animal, he cried. It's no natural thing at all. Shut up, man, Sid hissed through his teeth. It's a demon, Rodney insisted. Drawn to our greed, our wickedness? Rod, please, Jess whispered. We need to repent, we need to. I think it was Sid who hit him. Not hard enough to knock him out, but enough to send him sprawling. I took a step back. A few of us did. Rashi was the only one who knelt beside Rodney, offering Sid a sharp glare. But no one else seemed to care. I don't know of many animals that can survive 8 pickaxes to the skull. Someone muttered. I don't remember their name. None. Ralph corrected. We all did the math. There weren't enough weapons to go around. Rodney could barely stand. Paul had a broken arm. That left me and 2 others with nothing but rocks. Rashi, at least, had a little more luck. He still had his knife. Rashi carried that knife everywhere, called it a karambit, a long, curved dagger, ornate and foreign-looking. Back in the 50s, a man walking around with a blade like that wouldn't raise an eyebrow in Appalachia. Hell, it wasn't unusual to see folks strolling through town with a 6-shooter on their hip. Not that any of us had a gun that day. I sure would have traded my rock for a decent blade, though the biggest danger here is friendly fire. Someone said that. Can't remember his name now. I remember his stories, though. He'd been a sergeant in Korea. Time does a hell of a number on a man's memory. The old vet gave us a few quick words of advice. Watch where you swing, and don't stop hitting until the thing stops moving. With his help, we formed a rough plan. Who would approach from which angle, who would fight alongside whom. But the longer we stood there, the more our nerves got the better of us. The thing had been silent for too long. Was it waiting, planning? Was it even smart enough for that? Whatever the case, we couldn't stall forever. Moving as one, we rounded the bend and raised our lanterns. The mine was dim. Half the standing lights were out, and the ones still working were knocked over, casting jagged streaks of light in random directions. If the creature was lurking in the shadows, we couldn't see it, but the blood told its own story. Dark smears trailed across the dirt, leading into the pirate chest. The thing had dragged the bodies back to its lair. What was left of Hooper Collins' leg was still pinned beneath the boulder, but the rest of him, gone. No one wanted to be the first one in, so we crept forward, inch by inch, weapons raised, and then it struck, not from the ground. From above, it dropped straight onto Sarge, and in that instant, the whole plan fell apart. Half of us ran, half tried to fight. I did a little of both. I'll do my best to describe it. Just keep in mind, this was nearly 30 years ago. And even back then, I only got a clear look once. At least with my waking eyes. I've seen it plenty in my dreams since. It was fast. Faster than anything that size should be. And it didn't move like a person. It moved like a nightmare, all bending and twisting, its spine coiled like a snake in the middle of a strike. It had too many limbs to count, at least 4 legs and just as many arms. At the end of each, dozens of fingers, or maybe they were antennae, or tendrils, or something like the spindly legs of a shrimp. It had no eyes. I remember that part clearly. No eyes, just a mouth, long and serrated, like an earwig's tail mixed with a crocodile's jaw. And it was thin, too thin for something that strong. Its flesh looked almost translucent, warm-like, but that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was the armor. Chitin, maybe, if it was some kind of bug. But it didn't fit together like an insect's shell. It interlocked, more like a crawfish's plates. That thing ripped Sarge apart in seconds. I wanted to charge in. Maybe I would have. Instead, I hurled my rock, useless. Might as well have tossed a pebble into a river. Even the strongest men, swinging axes with all they had, couldn't put a dent in its armor. I spotted the pick Sarge had dropped. Or maybe it was still clenched in his severed hand. Either way, I moved toward it. And then the thing grabbed Ralph. I'd like to think I would have helped him. I really would. But I never got the chance. Rushy moved first. Without hesitation, he drove that curved blade straight into the creature. It sank in effortlessly, like cutting into soft fruit. To this day, I don't know why it worked. Maybe the dagger was stronger than our picks. Maybe it was made of something special. Maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever the case, the creature recoiled. Not a sound came from it. Not a screech, not a howl, just a jerking, twisting reaction as it let Ralph go. Lucky strike or not, it didn't matter. 2 more bodies were already lying at the thing's feet. And at that moment, there was only one thought in most of our heads. Run. And that's exactly what we did, except for Sid McNamer. In the chaos, he'd found something, dynamite. "Keep your distance, boys," he yelled, gripping the lit stick as he ran toward the creature. Now don't go thinking Sid was some noble martyr. He wasn't, but he sure as hell wasn't afraid to go out with a bang. I knew Sid as well as anyone, and I can tell you this, he never planned on dying down there. Just like he never planned to slip on a pile of guts, twist his ankle so bad he couldn't stand, lose his grip on the dynamite, and fail to take the creature out with the blast. Most of us managed to get clear, except for Sid, of course. He went out the way we all figured he would, though in a fashion no oracle could have foreseen. At least we were alive. Our ears rang and our eyes burned from the explosion, but we were better off than the creature. It staggered in all directions, flailing and stumbling over itself. A sound-driven thing, blinded by the noise. Maybe that's why it didn't even react when Rodney screamed for divine intervention. We didn't have time to question it. Ralph spotted our way out, a chimney shaft, blasted open by the explosion. A vertical passage. We'd have to make a break for it, right through the middle of the room, praying the creature was still too disoriented to notice us. The only way up was to climb, one man hosted onto the shoulders of another. Not ideal, but there weren't any other options. So we ran. Jess felt wept as he scrambled onto my back, and for a moment, I judged him for it, until I realized I was crying too. To his credit, once he reached the opening, Jess found a ledge and did his best to help pull the rest of us up. Halfway through, felt rushy and a couple others already safe. The creature lashed out. It caught someone, Matthew Stewart, I think. None of us looked back. None of us tried to help. And if I'm being honest, I remember feeling a flicker of relief, a distraction. Just enough time for the rest of us to climb. A sinful thought, sure, but I've had worse. 8 or 9 of us remained. 2 had lanterns. We shined them upward, hoping to see where the passage led. But even then, we couldn't see the ceiling. I don't know the odds of that. Of a vertical tunnel leading straight to the surface. A miracle, maybe. We've been delivered, Rodney whispered, his voice thick with reverence. No one disagreed. We climbed. I don't know how long time lost meaning. Adrenaline carried us, but exhaustion clawed at our limbs. At first, we braced our backs against one wall, pressing our feet to the opposite and inching our way up. Then the shaft sloped, forcing us to scramble on all fours. Sometimes, the walls widened, allowing us to help the weaker men. Other times, they closed in so tight we had to squeeze through one at a time. In one of those narrow shafts, we lost a man, Liam. A wide frame can be a blessing in a mine or a curse, and for Liam, it was the latter. No matter how we pushed from below or pulled from above, he wouldn't budge. Within minutes, he was stuck so tight he couldn't even go back down. I'd have to break my shoulders to move, he muttered. Ralph didn't hesitate. I can do it. How? Liam asked, still lodged tight. Instead of answering, he pulled out his pocket knife and slit his own throat. Rodney screamed, and all I could think was how lucky I was to be above him instead of below. In the end, we still had to break his arms to get him loose. But Liam didn't mind. His body dropped 10 feet before wedging itself somewhere lower. We kept climbing. No time for prayers. Those would come later. Then, just when hope had started to creep in, we found the worst thing any of us had ever seen. And I don't mean the creature. I mean the ceiling. Solid rock. One of the lanterns flickered out. It can't be, Rodney whispered, voice barely more than a breath. We're trapped, someone else muttered. The odds of making it all the way out were always slim, Ralph said, no emotion in his voice. I just wish we had a few cigarettes to pass around. What time is it? My throat dry. Dark, Ralph murmured. Probably. Then they'll send somebody. Jess's voice cut through the silence. He sounded almost hopeful. I envied that. Maybe there's already a rescue party digging through the rubble, Jess went on. We could be home by morning. Home? Ralph scoffed. Is that what you want? Felt. Jess hesitated. All our friends and fathers, Ralph continued, digging themselves into the same grave as us. No, Jess said quietly. Of course not. Then come on, Hatfield. And we waited. I just mean shut up, Ralph muttered, and he did. No one spoke much after that. For the next hour, there were only the occasional quiet sobs and a few grim chuckles. I think in that silence, most of us made our peace with what was coming. A small part of me still held on to hope that someone was out there, digging through the rubble. But there was no way to warn them, no way to tell them we were still alive. Nothing to do but wait, and then the last lantern flickered out. I doubt you've ever known a darkness like that one. Maybe you've been underground before. Maybe you've been in pitch black, but this wasn't just the absence of light. It was the kind of dark that seeps into you, fills your insides like cold water. The kind where even if someone is inches from your face, you don't see the faintest glow of their eyes. It was a void so absolute that for a moment, I was certain we'd never see light again. The small space we had crammed ourselves into suddenly felt suffocating. The rough stone scraping against my back became impossible to ignore. I wouldn't wish that kind of death on anyone. Being buried alive, I would have traded anything just to be able to stretch my arms. It was almost like drowning. I'd nearly drowned once. When I was 12, showing off for Susan by trying to swim across the lake. It had been fun at first, easy, until the realization hit me like a bat to the gut. How much water there was beneath me. I remember the sheer weight of it, how it pressed down as I slipped under. An older girl pulled me out before I even had time to be embarrassed. There was no one coming to save me this time. But then, something reached out for us, a sliver of light. It took a moment for our eyes to adjust, to even believe what we were seeing. A thin streak of blue above our heads. The moon. I thought I was hallucinating until Jess let out a shriek of joy. The chimney went all the way to the surface. The problem was, the opening was barely more than a slit. Far too small for any of us to climb through, like Artemis herself was teasing us. That's the moon goddess, right? I mumbled. I can do it, Rashi said suddenly. The hell you can? Ralph snapped. Rashi turned to him, placing a hand on his cheek. Have faith. A rod swallowed hard. I have faith. Rashi nodded, then stripped off his boots and jacket, spat in his hands, and steadied himself. Rashi called out. He turned. I have faith too. He smiled. I'll be back. With a whole lot of people and a whole lot of guns, Ralph added. Rashi grinned. And guns. Then, just as he was about to go, he hesitated. I thought for a second he was second, guessing himself. Instead, he turned to me and handed me his knife. I thought your religion said you always had to carry this, I said. Rashi just chuckled. Then up he went. We couldn't see him climb. His body blocked out the light, but we could hear him, the soft grunts and scrapes of his effort. For minutes, we listened as he forced his way through that impossibly narrow slit. Then silence. I feared he'd gotten stuck. Then his voice echoed down to us. I made it. I'll be back soon. For the first time since the cave-in, the air didn't feel quite so heavy. Rod started praying again. Thank you. I'm done with drinking. I'm done with gambling. I'll never stray from my wife again. Speak for yourself, someone muttered. First thing I'm doing when we get out of this is having a cold beer. Make that 3, another added. We laughed, too loud, too hard. The kind of laughter that wasn't really about the joke, just about needing to hear something other than silence. Then I heard it. Shit, I hissed. The laughter died in an instant. The silence wasn't empty anymore. The air was thick with sound. The slow, wet tearing of flesh, the crunch of bones, the deep, guttural swallowing of something that had gone too long without a meal. Liam. Rodney's voice trembled. No, we were delivered. Why is it back? We were delivered, he whispered again, like saying it enough times might make it true. Sang's coming, Jess said quickly. With guns. He'll make it back fast. I wanted to believe him. It took that thing a while to eat last time, someone muttered. We've got time. Ralph's voice was low. Last time it had more than one body. The implication hung heavy in the air. If it finished with Liam before Rashi returned, I don't know if I came up with the idea on my own, or if Ralph was hinting at it. But a way to buy us a few more precious minutes crossed my mind. And I hated myself for thinking it. I didn't say it out loud. The thought was too cruel, too monstrous. But I didn't have to. Rodney spoke it for me. An offering, he whispered. Nobody responded right away, but we all knew what he meant. That thing down there, it's a devil, he continued, voice trembling with conviction. Eve, demonic spirit. We don't know that, Ralph muttered. Rodney pressed on. It's a demon if there ever was one, and demons are drawn to wickedness like moths to a flame. Someone brought it here, and only an offering will satisfy it. An evil offering for an evil thing. Jess felt stiffened. What exactly are you saying, Rod? No one answered. Not right away. Then came the sound, a deep, wet crack, the snap of bone, the slick pull of marrow being sucked clean. The creature was finishing its meal. Maybe you're right, Rod, Ralph said, voice quieter now. Maybe this devil's wanted a sacrifice all along. Jess let out a short, humorless laugh, though under different circumstances, it might have been a scoff. Come on, Ralph. You don't actually believe that superstition, do you? I don't know what I believe anymore. Ralph's voice was hollow. But I know that thing is still hungry, and I've got a pretty strong idea who the most wicked man among us is. Silence. Then, softly, he comes from a long line of wicked folk. The next few minutes blur in my memory, maybe because I've tried to block them out. But, like most things I've tried in my life, I didn't do it well enough. Please understand. I don't remember laying a finger on Jess felt, cross my heart and swear on my children. The way I recall it, I stood back, I watched. Maybe I even tried to reason with Ralph and the others to leave Jess alone. I've gone over it 1,000 times, maybe 100,000, and still, I don't remember myself as a murderer, but maybe the mind is stronger than the soul, able to twist memories too terrible to bear, because I do remember my knuckles raw and bloodied, half mine, half his. I remember the way his once handsome face turned flat as a washboard, the sharp angles of his cheekbones and nose lost under the fists of a dozen men. I remember how pale he looked in the moonlight, white as marble. I remember his screams, his why, his please stop. And then, when words failed, the pitiful, wet gurgles, much worse than the sounds the creature had made. That's the memory that haunts me. Most days I forget, but every night I remember. Whiskey helps. A little. And that's how you know if the old-timer telling you this story was really there. That's how you can be sure. Before we tossed Jess's body into the pit, we all nodded, a silent pact, not a word, not to each other, not to anyone. That was the unspoken vow. So if someone knows about what happened to Jess felt, they were there. No mistake. I've spent years wondering if I could have stopped it. I knew it was wrong. I remember protesting at least a little. I had Rashi's knife. I knew the creature hated loud sounds. Maybe, if I'd had the courage, I could have fought it off. But if I'd stood in the way of that mob, would they have killed me too? However you cut it, I was a coward. Still am. I would have given in, no doubt. I just wish Rashi hadn't left for help. He wouldn't have let it happen. Rashi was a good man, and he kept his word. But in the end, the guns weren't needed. The rescue party never came across the creature. Maybe it fled when it sensed all those people gathering above. By the time they dug us out, it was gone. When they went back into the mine to recover what little remained of the bodies, there was no sign of it. Most of the survivors skipped town, left without so much as a goodbye. 1 or 2 came back, eventually. The rest never saw them again. It was just as well. With the biggest mine shut down, work was scarce. The owner talked about reopening a few times, clearing the rubble. But most of the workers threatened to strike if he did. Didn't matter to me by then. I'd switched trades. Spent the next 20 years in lumber. But that mine, still buried. And I pray it stays that way. I still hear about it. Kids go up there sometimes, daring each other to hike to the collapsed mine, to touch the big cursed rock pile. Their parents warn them off. Talk about cave-ins, rattlesnakes, all the usual dangers. Their grandparents warn them too. But for different reasons, it's still out there somewhere. Maybe it found another cavern to call home. Or maybe it never liked being underground in the first place. Maybe it's out there in some forest, roaming the hills, waiting. Before we came along, I think it was trapped, and we set it loose upon the world. I guess I'll never know for sure, not that I'd want to. I'll be dead soon, in a box or an urn. Maybe Rashi had the right idea. Things that get buried don't always stay that way. I'd have myself burned too if it wouldn't stir up a fuss at the church. Funny, why should I care? I've probably stepped inside that building fewer than 100 times. Weddings, funerals, Easter Sundays, that's about it. And yet, people would talk. There'd be a scandal all the same. I never made much trouble while I was alive. No sense in starting after I'm dead. Telling you this, telling the whole story, even the worst of it, is my kind of penance. People ought to know what's out there in the dark, just as much as they should know what we did. One day, when my time comes and I have to stand before Jess Felt, have to look him in the eye and answer for what I've done, at least I'll be able to say I told the truth. Not right away, of course. I kept quiet through the golden years. Maybe that's why. Wherever I'm headed, whatever hell is waiting for me, I've got a feeling I'll be meeting that thing again.